Hello, good morning, everybody. I'd like to first take the opportunity to thank the organizers, first commend them for this quite impressive gathering here in Strasbourg, but also thank them for inviting me, especially Herman and Camille and Barbara, Joël and the team at the Maillon who are hosting us here. And of course, I would like to thank our translators, to whom I offer my apologies in advance. It has been a pleasure to be here these days because I met quite a few of the colleagues I've known and worked with over the years, but I have also met in person for the first time colleagues that I've met over Zoom during the pandemic. So it's really great to put a body under a head, which was our joint experience for 2 years and a half. Well, I think that I'm a little bit intimidated by the size of this screen because my presentation looked very humble on my laptop, and now it really makes me feel a little bit overwhelmed, so I feel a little bit nervous. Herman said enough about me already. I'm the General Secretary and founding member of this network, and I just briefly wanted to say that this gave me the opportunity for some hands-on experience on the topic, because we set up early on a green managers group among our membership, and in 2013 we organized an international conference on sustainability and culture with a focus on sustainable culture management, which then somehow evolved into a need for capacity building for our membership and the sector. And that led in 2016 to our SCM course, the Sustainable Culture Management course, which we co-designed with Julie's Bicycle. So this is my other hat. Julie's Bicycle, for those that don't know, is a charity based in the UK and has been working extensively since 2007 to bridge environmental sustainability with culture and to mobilize the cultural sector to take climate action. That same year, in 2016, I joined Julie's Bicycle as an associate partner, and we have been working a lot together so far. Now, in the last 2 years, as Herman mentioned, I have intensified my research because I've been working on this book on sustainable theater, and my research took me back because I was trying to unearth as much as possible of what has been around previously in the past. So my research took me back to as much as 30 years ago. Sometimes I was quite impressed by what I discovered. The more I searched, the more I realized the impressive amount and quality of work which had been accomplished by a relatively small number of truly pioneering individuals, organizations, and other culture agents. And as a proof of this, I prepared for you just a very small indicative selection of initiatives over a period of 20 years, which I stress is preceding the Paris Agreement, which brought the topic to the mainstream. So it's before the Paris Agreement. So look, for example, in 1993, this is the first ever book on ecological practice for theater, which was published in the US, Greening Up Our Houses, a guide to a more ecologically sound theater by Larry Freed and Theresa May. Then in 2008, next to it, the Green Theatre Plan for London was published by the Mayor of London upon the initiative of several cultural leaders. And then also expert organizations like Julie's Bicycle, the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts and the Broadway Green Alliance in the US, and Creative Carbon Scotland. These organizations were founded between 2007 and 2011 already. And then if we look at organizations, the Göteborg Opera introduced their environmental sustainability strategy in 2001. The Lyon Opera started in 2009. The Avignon Festival initiated their environmental strategy in 2010. And the Festival d'Aix-en-Provence published their own experience of working on the idea of eco-conception de décor. This guide was already published in 2012. And just here at the corner, I don't know if it's behind me, another publication. I think that's the first actual book, published printed book on green production, which was published by Ellen Jones in 2014 in the US. So it's a very practical, as it says, a practical guide to greener theater. So as you see, many of these remarkable initiatives came from high-profile institutions, and yet they remained largely marginal. So we are now almost 10 years post all this work. And one cannot but wonder why it took so long for the sector to become interested and engaged at scale. So yesterday, of course, we heard a lot about the delay mechanisms and the barriers, so I will not tire you with this. But this question, so why was the sector lagging behind? It did buzz in my head for quite a while, until I decided to shift my perspective, and instead of looking to find the barriers, I tried to identify the enabling conditions. In other words, the enabling frameworks for action. So, obviously, as it becomes clear from the title of my presentation, I believe that if we are to upscale grassroots initiatives, to facilitate and catalyze action, but also to institutionalize the ecological transition of the sector, we need policy. And we need policy on two levels. On the sectoral level, policy as an expression of cultural leadership, mainly through organizations, and on a systemic level, by mainstreaming the climate agenda into culture policy. So in connection to the first, I will give you two examples of cultural leadership, two prominent public theatre institutions that began their environmental journey more than 15 years ago. The National Theatre in London and the Sydney Theatre Company embarked on their respective environmental sustainability projects, Anti-Future and Greening the Wharf, both in 2006. Although geographically distant and unrelated to one another, it is interesting to look at the common features of these examples. So both projects were developed inside a favorable political context, at a moment when both in the UK and in Australia, the climate agenda was high in the priorities of both the national and the local governments. Both projects were very ambitious and designed with a long perspective into the future. The interventions came at a high cost, but the projects managed to secure and attract and secure both public and private funding. The range of projects was holistic, so they covered buildings, operations, stage production, organizational structures, and capacity building. Both projects opted for measurable results, securing transparency and credibility, so through annual reports, the use of measuring tools, certifications, and compliance with relevant legislation. Both projects became very central in the organization's missions and branding, and both were meant to act as gestures of sector leadership, to the ambition to serve as an example. So let's just quickly glance at how the National Theatre presents their environmental sustainability policy on their website. So it's part of their communication and branding. So you see it's organized around the commitments, monitoring and reporting, and then it's outlined around people, so audiences and staff, place, the building and transport issues, and production, the programming, the artistic programming, and how they make productions. Furthermore, here they present in a quite detailed manner the areas of work and the achievements of the theater. So you have on top the most recent engagement with green production. They have been trialing the Theatre Green Book. I suppose some of you know about it already. And then you see they have done a lot of work on energy, heating and cooling, water, waste, biodiversity, and then partnerships and collaboration with the sector. So if you take the time to read through, you will see also the results in numbers. I mean, exactly how much they have reduced their carbon footprint, how much they have reduced energy use, waste recycling, and so on and so forth. Likewise, Greening the Wharf was launched by the Sydney Theatre Company in 2006, specifically as a central concept in the mission of Kate Blanchett and Andrew Upton, who took over the direction of the theatre then. So the project was hailed, not just in Australia, but also internationally as groundbreaking at the time, because it invested very much on technological innovation around sustainability. So the centerpiece of the project was this impressive array of solar panels, hundreds of them, that were laid on the top of the building, and one has to note that it is a heritage building, so it was really a very innovative approach to sustainability. And then they also came up with a very unique solution for rainwater collection system, which they actually installed under the pier, as you see here. So in short, the theatre focused, like the National Theatre, on impacts reduction and then transparency and measurable outcomes by systematically reducing their actual impacts, the main areas being, as you see, energy, water, waste, and green design. Mind you, they introduced a green design policy in 2011 already, so actually making it part of the contracts with set designers. And here you see some of the outcomes. So between 2007 and 2017, they reduced their CO2 impacts by 50%. So it was very much a practical approach and very much integrated into the theatres, both theatres' general policies. Now, there is one substantial difference, however, between the two. In Sydney, once Blanchett and Upton left, and then a succession of conservative, non-climate friendly governments took over, Sydney Theatre Company lost the momentum to motivate the sector at large. So the project remained exemplary but solitary. On the contrary, the National Theatre continued to evolve its environmental policy to this day and to exercise climate leadership in the sector to this day, not just because of its committed leadership throughout, but also due to a wider favorable context, a fruitful interplay between policymakers and the sector, which combined a bottom-up and a top-down approach. And so here's the story in brief. In 2007, the Mayor of London published the Climate Change Plan for London. And in 2008, the UK Climate Change Act was voted by a cross-partisan parliamentary majority. And let us note that this was the first climate policy internationally and still continues to be thought as a model climate policy for others. So in these two policy frameworks, it was foreseen that the general climate plans would have to be mainstreamed into all the different sectors of activity. But culture was not included. So this led senior voices from key culture organizations to publicly advocate for inclusion of the culture sector and for greater environmental action. The first tangible result of this mobilization was the 2008 Green Theatre Guide that I mentioned before, which was published as a joint project of the Mayor's Office and sustainability leaders from the theatre sector. So this created a very special momentum, a window of opportunity. The sector was ready. There were a lot of grassroots initiatives already, including the leading one, the National Theatre. There was sectoral leadership. There was a group of climate advocates that were lobbying the Arts Council England, which is the equivalent of a Ministry of Culture. It's the main funding body. And it was at that moment that the Arts Council was drafting its new policy for its new funding agreements. The result, in 2012, Arts Council England made it a funding requirement for all national portfolio organizations and major museum partners, so the publicly subsidized sector, to report on their environmental impacts. Initially it was energy, water and waste, and to design and put in place an environmental policy and action plan. But there was an important accompanying feature. An extensive support program was designed and delivered by Julie's Bicycle to build skills and capacity in the sector so that organizations could feel confident to act on climate change and reduce their environmental impact. Furthermore, from year one, there were annual reports recording the achievements, quite impressive, as you may see. So between 2012 and the report just before the pandemic, there was already a decrease of 35% in CO2 emissions across the sector. Direct consumption of energy was reduced by 23%, and of course there were also savings of almost 17 million pounds. Interestingly, the assessment included the non-measurable transformation of the sector, called a strand called Beyond Carbon, which basically looked at how organizations were contributing to a new creative ecology, that is developing new skills and knowledge, going for green technologies, sustainable goods and services, opting for greener waste solutions or for renewable energy suppliers. And then you see here, for instance, from the latest report, the key statistics record simultaneously reduced impacts and enhanced benefits. All this experience finally fed into each new iteration of the policy, the most recent one being the strategy for 2020-2030, where environmental sustainability is not just one strand, but it is one of the main funding principles, as you see here. And here I will not go into detail, but it's important to stress that the same political framework, which Creative Carbon Scotland have nicely summed up here, has led to a similar cultural policy framework in Scotland, designed by Creative Carbon Scotland in collaboration with Creative Carbon Scotland. So we may say that Creative Scotland is the equivalent of the Arts Council in this case, and Creative Carbon Scotland is the equivalent of Julie's Bicycle. So we have the same concept adapted just 3 years later than the Arts Council adapted in the local context. And yet, although these two approaches seem and are quite pioneering, there was an earlier attempt to integrate environmental sustainability into culture policy. I should say sustainability before I say environmental and explain why. So, following the publication of the French government's National Sustainable Development Strategy for 2010-2013, which called for interministerial implementation, the French Ministry of Culture created a sustainable development strategy for the sector in 2011. The emphasis here was mainly on the role culture could play on sustainable development. However, the plan, the action plan, included a kind of encouragement towards the sector for the implementation of environmental practices in the management of cultural buildings, their operations and supply chains. The next strategic framework for 2015-2020 aligned more closely with the Paris Agreement. So here you see that it's called ecological transition towards sustainable development. Now this time the strategy endorsed more explicitly the global climate agenda and included a strand exclusively dedicated to environmental sustainability. The framework was more detailed than the previous one, including a proposed action plan with specific measures and indicators, while it required public institutions to submit annual reports recording their initiatives and tracking progress. From what I have found in bilans like that, in reports, it seems that despite the innovative character of their intentions, both of these policy frameworks failed to promote environmental sustainability in the cultural sector at scale, with the exception of a few notable initiatives across the country. Why was that? In my opinion, one of the reasons was the cultural policy's close entanglement with the Sustainable Development Agenda, which, in my opinion, is too broad to translate into action. Secondly, it was primarily a top-down approach, which did not foresee any follow-up or support mechanisms that would facilitate wider and more effective application by the sector. But as there were more and more voices from the art and culture sector in France who called for tangible action in the last few years especially, the SHIFT project is one of them, of course. There is an interesting manifeste des indépendants that includes suggestions on environmental sustainability. So in late 2021, the Ministry of Culture presented a sustainable development charter for festivals, this time focusing very clearly on climate and environmental action. And more recently, and I thank Camille, who was kind enough to bring to my attention the latest intervention by the new Minister of Culture, who announced 5 axes for the ecological transition, which altogether, I think, clearly indicate a shift of focus towards a sector-specific, results-oriented, combined with guidance, support, incentives, and evaluation. So at this point, we could eventually maybe venture to draft a blueprint for action based on what has worked and what has not worked. So let us assume then that an effective plan for action requires a cultural policy framework, sector-specific, which legitimizes action, unlocks funding, and helps the sector to overcome systemic barriers. We need focus on environmental sustainability. Yes, carbon footprint, greenhouse gas emissions, environmental impacts, rather than a broad and abstract engagement with the idea of sustainable development. Do we need mandatory features? I would say yes, mandatory or semi-mandatory, connected to funding, but together with an elaborate support framework. So capacity building, resources, sectoral networking and collaboration, data collection, and so on and so forth. And finally, what seems to have worked is this facilitating partner, like Creative Carbon Scotland, like Julie's Bicycle. They seem to have played a very important role, like a go-between between policymakers and the implementation of policy in the sector. And what seem to be prerequisites for an effective culture policy? First of all, the appropriate framing. I'm using again Ben's nice organizing of the umbrella ideas here, the umbrella policies. So it is important to have a general policy framework which is favorable. It is very important to have mobilization from the sector and collaboration with the sector. It is important to have grassroots initiatives on which to build further. Cultural leadership is of paramount importance, involving the main players and the prestigious institutions. And of course, needless to say, we need policymakers who are engaged and open to work with the sector. And closing, where are we now? We do have an appropriate policy framework. The EU Green Deal and the climate law, and as they are more or less mainstreamed into national climate policies, create a good foundation. And then we also have the directives for greening Creative Europe. We also have a lot of mobilization in the sector, especially on a European level, like us today, networks, professional associations, and many other agents. On top of the previous grassroots and other initiatives, which are now becoming more visible, we also have an abundance of more recent innovative sectoral work. As you know, we have many projects, guides, tools, capacity building initiatives. So let's say that we are more or less okay in the first three. Do we have cultural leadership? Well, yes, we do on an international and European level, but we still lack cultural leadership on a national, regional, and local level. And we are also very much in need of cultural policymakers, again, on a national, regional, and local level. This is crucial in my opinion. It is not possible to coordinate cultural action from a centralized European perspective. We need to move the policy making and the action plans closer to home, wherever home is for each one of us. And I'm closing with a few afterthoughts, or before thoughts, because I had them for a long time. So, exceptionalism. We tend to stress the exceptional character of our work, of our sector. But when it comes to the ecological transition, it is perhaps more effective to focus not so much on what makes us exceptional, but on everything that connects us to all the other sectors in a systemic manner. For instance, energy, buildings, questions of transportation and mobility, these are issues that cannot be solved outside of the wider political plans for the transition. Maximalism. We have worked for almost 20 years along the assumptions of the creative industries concept, the idea of the arts and culture as accelerators of local development, drivers of growth, economic growth, etc. This has inevitably placed a lot of emphasis on quantity and tangible outcomes. Is it not perhaps time to question this maximalist approach? Is it not time to consider its environmental implications as well? Third point, the future. We're actually, not just here, but in other fora, in the process of shaping and reshaping the future of the performing arts in view of the new climate regime. However, this future, to a large degree, will be inhabited by the younger generation of practitioners and artists who are not here. Some of them are making their first difficult steps in the profession. Others are still studying. In fact, they are being educated along the lines of a previous reality. Much of their training is perhaps already obsolete. Therefore, we need to consider fairness in this respect. So I believe we need to try a bit harder and find ways to integrate their ideas, their thoughts, their fears and dreams for the future in the plans that we are making. And finally, everyone's favorite, reinventing the wheel. I would say, let's not do that. Good poets borrow, great poets still. So let's get as much as possible from each other, from everything that existed before us, because this will have to be a culture of sharing. And having said that, I close by sharing with you a central motto of my work, which I have borrowed or stolen, if you'd like, from the climate pages of the Atlantic Review. Climate change can only be solved the old-fashioned way, through curiosity, humility, and democracy. Thank you for listening.